Welcome to Books Arena. Today, we're diving into the life of one of the most iconic and misunderstood minds in modern history, Steve Jobs. But this isn't the story you think you know. Becoming Steve Jobs by Brent Schlender and Tetzeli is not your typical biography. It doesn't just focus on the legend, it shows the man behind the image. Not just the bold decisions, but the doubts, the failures, the growth. Most people know Steve Jobs as a genius, someone who changed the world with Apple products like the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac. But few people understand how he became that visionary. Because in the beginning, Steve Jobs was impulsive, difficult, and often reckless. He was brilliant, yes, but also immature and unpredictable. So what changed? This book shows how Steve evolved, not suddenly, but over time. From a fiery young founder who got fired from his own company, to a thoughtful, patient leader who built the most valuable company on earth. It's a journey of failure, reflection, and transformation. So if you've ever wondered, what made Steve Jobs so driven? What did he learn from being rejected? How did he go from arrogant to admired? Then this summary is for you. Let's begin the journey of becoming Steve Jobs. A story about learning, changing, and becoming someone greater than you were yesterday. Part 1, The Early Years, a Rebel with Vision. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco and adopted shortly after by Paul and Clara Jobs, a modest and hard-working couple. From the start, Steve was different. He was curious, intense, and often difficult to manage, a mix of rebelliousness and raw intelligence. In school, Steve was bright but bored. He questioned authority, challenged teachers, and refused to do things just because others said so. One teacher said, if he decided it was worth doing, he'd do it brilliantly. But if not, he just wouldn't do it at all. This was a pattern that followed Steve throughout his early life. He operated on his own terms. As a teenager growing up in Silicon Valley, Steve was drawn to electronics. His father, a mechanic and craftsman, taught him how to take things apart and put them back together. Steve saw firsthand how design and function could work in harmony, a lesson he would carry into his work at Apple decades later. But while his father focused on craftsmanship, Steve was more interested in ideas, especially those that pushed boundaries. He read spiritual books, practiced meditation, and experimented with alternative lifestyles. He even went to India in search of enlightenment. But don't mistake this for a calm, peaceful mindset. Steve was known to be impatient, demanding, and even rude at times. He had strong opinions and didn't hesitate to share them, often bluntly. Still, something about him was magnetic. Even at a young age, people noticed that he had a way of pulling others into his vision. The Wozniak connection. In high school, Steve met Steve Wozniak, an engineering genius and fellow prankster. Woz was quiet, thoughtful, and brilliant at building computers. Jobs saw in Woz something valuable, not just a friend, but a partner. The two collaborated on small tech projects. One of their early creations was the Blue Box, a device that let you make free long-distance calls by tricking the phone system. It was illegal, but it showed them something important. With the right mix of creativity and technology, they could build things people wanted. That realization would lead them to their biggest creation, Apple. Founding Apple. In 1976, in the Jobs family garage, Steve and Wozniak founded Apple Computer. Woz built the machines. Jobs pitched the vision. Their first product, the Apple I, was simple but groundbreaking, a personal computer that hobbyists could use without building one from scratch. But it was the Apple II that made Apple a real business. It had color graphics, a keyboard, and a sleek design. More importantly, it brought computing to the average person. Steve Jobs quickly became the face of Apple. Young, confident, and unconventional, he stood out in the tech industry. He didn't wear suits. He talked about design and philosophy, not just hardware. And he pushed his team to aim higher than anyone thought possible. But here's the catch: he was also very difficult to work with. Jobs demanded perfection. He would insult engineers if their work didn't meet his expectations. He made decisions on gut feeling. He could be charming one moment and dismissive the next. People either loved working with him, or couldn't take it and left. The Macintosh and the limits of vision. Steve's biggest passion became the Macintosh, a new kind of computer with a graphical interface, something no one else had done before. He wanted it to be beautiful, intuitive, and revolutionary. And it was, but it also exposed his flaws as a leader. Jobs pushed the Mac team mercilessly. He expected them to work day and night. He rejected good ideas because they didn't fit his vision. And he ignored advice from more experienced managers. The Macintosh launched in 1984 with huge fanfare. The commercial was iconic. The product was stunning. But it was also too expensive and underpowered. Sales didn't meet expectations. Apple's board of directors grew worried. Steve was a visionary, but they questioned whether he could actually run a company. By 1985, tensions boiled over. Steve was removed from his leadership role and eventually left Apple altogether. The first turning point. Here's what's important to understand. This version of Steve Jobs' brilliant, intense, but immature is not the Steve Jobs who created the iPhone. This was Steve at the beginning of his journey. Yes, he had bold ideas. Yes, he pushed boundaries. But he hadn't yet learned how to lead with humility, how to listen, or how to build something that could last beyond his energy alone. Becoming Steve Jobs shows that greatness isn't just about having vision. It's about growing into the kind of person who can turn that vision into reality with others, not just in spite of them. The early years of Steve Jobs were filled with genius, conflict, and flashes of brilliance. But the best was yet to come. Part 2, The Fall and the Learning Years, Next and Pixar. After being pushed out of Apple in 1985, Steve Jobs was just 30 years old. He was famous. He was wealthy. But he was also lost. For the first time, he had no company, no team, no product to obsess over. And more importantly, no clear direction. He later called it the best thing that ever happened to him. But at the time, it felt like total failure. So what did he do? He started again. From scratch. Next, a new company, same old habits. Soon after leaving Apple, Steve launched a new company called Next Inc. The goal was ambitious, to build the world's most powerful computer, one designed specifically for education and creative professionals. Jobs poured his energy and millions of his own dollars into the company. He wanted Next to be perfect, even revolutionary. But here's the catch: Steve hadn't really changed yet. He was still chasing perfection over practicality. He still micromanaged. He still let design overpower deadlines. The first Next computer was beautiful. It had a sleek black cube design. The operating system was advanced and elegant. But it was also too expensive and too complex for the market. Schools couldn't afford it. Developers found it difficult to work with. The product failed commercially. In the outside world, people started saying Steve Jobs had peaked early, that Apple was a fluke, and he wasn't capable of running a real business after all. But something different was happening behind the scenes. The shift begins: personal growth at Next. At Next, Steve hired new people, engineers, designers, marketers. And for the first time, he started to listen. Not always. Not perfectly. But more than before. He became more open to feedback. He didn't yell as often. He gave his team space to solve problems on their own. He also started to understand something he had missed at Apple: a great company isn't just built on great ideas. It's built on great people. And while Next didn't succeed as a hardware business, it produced something very important: its software platform. That software, called Next Step, was incredibly advanced. And years later, Apple would buy Next not for the hardware, but for that software. That software became the foundation for Mac OS, iOS, and the modern Apple ecosystem. So even though Next looked like a failure, it planted the seeds of Apple's future. Pixar, learning patience, trust, and creativity. While Next struggled, Steve also invested in a small animation studio called Pixar, which he bought from George Lucas. At first, Pixar wasn't about animated movies. It made software and short films, mainly for other companies. Jobs funded it, but he didn't fully understand the animation side. And that turned out to be a good thing. Why? Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the expert. He had to trust the creative team, people like Ed Catmull, John Lasseter, and Brad Bird, to do the work. He couldn't micromanage animation. So he stood back. And slowly, something changed in Steve Jobs. He began to appreciate collaboration. He saw the power of letting creative people lead as long as they had a clear mission and support. Pixar's first big breakthrough was Toy Story in 1995, the first full-length computer animated film. It was a global hit. Jobs didn't write it. He didn't direct it. but he made it possible. He protected the creative team, funded them through hard years, and negotiated deals with Disney to give Pixar the freedom it needed. Pixar went on to become one of the most successful studios in film history. And Steve Jobs, the control freak, became a supporter of creativity, not just the driver of it. The inner transformation. What's important here isn't just the business outcomes. It's how these years reshaped Steve Jobs as a person. At Next, he learned humility through failure. At Pixar, he learned trust through collaboration. As a father, he began reconnecting with his daughter Lisa, whom he had once denied. And as a leader, he learned that greatness comes from teams, not just ideas. These experiences matured him. He was still intense. Still focused. Still had high standards. But he was becoming more thoughtful, more human, and more strategic. As one Pixar colleague put it, he learned to listen. Not just hear but really listen. Laying the groundwork for a second act. By the mid-1990s, Steve Jobs was in a strange place. Pixar had become a success. Next was struggling but had powerful software. Apple, the company he founded, was on the verge of collapse. And then, Apple came calling. They needed new software. They needed vision. They needed help. In 1996, Apple bought Next for $429 million. And just like that, Steve Jobs was back at the company that had once fired him. But this time he was a different man. Smarter. Calmer. Wiser. The real Steve Jobs, the one who would lead Apple into its golden age, was finally ready. Part 3, The Return to Apple and the Birth of the iMac. In 1996, Apple was in serious trouble. The company that once revolutionized personal computing was now seen as outdated, slow, and almost irrelevant. Microsoft had taken over the market, and Apple's products were confusing, expensive, and failing to sell. Desperate, Apple made a bold move. They acquired Next, and with it, Steve Jobs. At first, Steve came back in a limited role. He was called an advisor, not a leader. But within months, it became clear, Apple needed more than advice, it needed vision. And Steve Jobs was ready. A new Steve Jobs returns. This was not the same Steve Jobs who had been fired 12 years earlier. Yes, he was still intense, demanding, and driven. But now, he was more thoughtful. More strategic. More capable of turning ideas into reality without burning everyone out in the process. He had matured, and Apple needed that maturity. The company was losing hundreds of millions of dollars. The product line was bloated with confusing models. The culture was unfocused. Jobs saw all of this and moved fast. First, he slashed the product line from dozens of machines to just 4 core categories. Consumer desktop. Consumer laptop. Professional desktop. Professional laptop. This move was shocking to Apple employees, but it brought clarity. For the first time in years, the company had a simple focus. He also cut unnecessary projects, streamlined teams, and started hiring smart, design-focused people, many of whom he had worked with at Next and Pixar. But Apple still needed more than focus. It needed a hit product. Enter the iMac. In 1998, Apple unveiled the iMac, a colorful, all-in-one computer that broke every rule of design. It wasn't beige. It wasn't boxy. It looked like something from the future, sleek, translucent, and fun. And more importantly, it was designed for regular people. It was simple to set up, easy to use, and visually exciting. Jobs worked closely with designer Johnny Ive, who would become one of his closest creative partners. Together, they obsessed over every detail, not just how the iMac worked, but how it felt. And the results were astonishing. The iMac became one of the fastest-selling computers in history. It brought Apple back into the spotlight. Suddenly, Apple was cool again. Why the iMac mattered so much? The iMac wasn't just a product, it was a statement. It said, Apple is back. It said, we care about design, not just specs. And it proved that Steve Jobs could still deliver breakthrough innovation, but now as a more mature, complete leader. More importantly, the iMac introduced a new way of thinking at Apple. Jobs began insisting that hardware, software, and design should be created together, tightly integrated, seamless, and user-focused. This idea would later become the foundation for the iPod, the iPhone, and everything that followed. Building a stronger culture. Behind the scenes, Jobs was rebuilding Apple's culture. He pushed teams to focus deeply on quality. He got rid of politics and silos. He made decisions quickly and expected others to do the same. But unlike the earlier Steve Jobs, he wasn't doing it alone. He empowered strong executives like Tim Cook, who would later become Apple CEO, and trusted them to execute. He still had high standards. He still expected excellence. But now, he had learned how to build a team and lead it. One Apple executive described the change this way. He used to be a tornado that left wreckage behind. Now he's a laser beam, focused and precise. Thinking ahead, the digital hub strategy. Even as Apple was recovering, Steve was already planning the next move. He believed the personal computer would become the digital hub for people's lives, connecting music, photos, video, and more. This idea became the roadmap for Apple's future. It led directly to the creation of iTunes, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. Jobs wasn't just trying to sell more computers. He was trying to redefine how we interact with technology. And for the first time, he had a team, a company, and a culture strong enough to do it. A new chapter begins. By the year 2000, Apple was no longer on life support. It was profitable. It was growing. And it was starting to lead again, not follow. Steve Jobs officially became CEO, dropping the interim title he had held since returning. But more than that, he had become something he had never been before. A trusted, admired, and capable CEO. The wild young founder who once got fired for being too reckless had now become the visionary leader of a company poised to change the world again. And he was just getting started. Part 4, The Age of Breakthroughs, the iPod, iTunes, and the dawn of a new era. By the early 2000s, Steve Jobs and Apple had found their footing again. The iMac's success was only the beginning. Steve was no longer just focused on making great computers, he had a bigger vision for how technology could transform everyday life. The digital hub vision comes to life. Steve saw the personal computer evolving into a digital hub, a central device where people could organize their digital lives, music, photos, videos, contacts, calendars, and more. But to truly realize this vision, Apple had to expand beyond just computers. This insight led to the birth of two game-changing products, the iPod and iTunes. The iPod, music, made simple. In 2001, Apple introduced the iPod, a portable music player that would change the music industry forever. It wasn't the first digital music player on the market, but it was different. Steve and his team obsessed over design and user experience in ways no one else did. The iPod was small, elegant, and incredibly easy to use. Its signature click wheel made navigating thousands of songs effortless. And it worked seamlessly with Apple's software, a combination that competitors struggled to match. Steve famously said the iPod was 1,000 songs in your pocket. This simple phrase captured something revolutionary: music was now mobile, personal, and instantly accessible. But the iPod was just one piece of the puzzle. iTunes, reinventing the music business. To complement the iPod, Apple developed iTunes, a digital music management software. iTunes wasn't just a music player on the computer, it was a store, a way to buy and organize music legally and easily. At the time, the music industry was battling rampant piracy and struggling to adapt to the digital age. Steve negotiated tirelessly with record labels, convincing them to sell songs individually at 99 cents each, a radical idea. This led to the launch of the iTunes Store in 2003, which changed how people bought music forever. Now, consumers could buy songs on demand, legally, and at affordable prices. The music industry reacts. Initially skeptical, the music labels soon realized iTunes was a lifeline against piracy. The combination of iPod hardware and iTunes software created an ecosystem that was incredibly sticky. Once you started using Apple's music platform, it was hard to leave. The iPod quickly became a cultural phenomenon, propelling Apple from a computer company to a consumer electronics giant. Lessons in leadership and focus. Behind these successes was Steve's relentless focus on simplicity and integration. He didn't want just a great product, he wanted a complete experience. Apple tightly controlled hardware and software, ensuring they worked flawlessly together. Steve was involved in every detail, from the white earbuds to the minimalist packaging. But this wasn't about ego, it was about creating products people loved. And crucially, Steve had grown in how he led teams to execute this vision. Instead of demanding perfection through fear and chaos, He fostered creativity with clear priorities and empowered trusted lieutenants to deliver. Expanding the digital hub. With the iPod and iTunes establishing Apple's foothold in music, Steve's vision extended further. He saw that people's digital lives were exploding with photos, videos, and documents, and that the Mac could be the hub for managing it all. This insight guided the development of new software like iPhoto, iMovie, and eventually GarageBand. Apple's ecosystem was no longer just computers and music players, it was becoming an integrated digital lifestyle brand. The road to the iPhone. Even as the iPod dominated the market, Steve was already thinking ahead. He believed the future lay in mobile devices that combined communication, media, and computing in one seamless experience. Behind the scenes, Apple was secretly developing a revolutionary product, a touch-screen phone that could run a full operating system. The groundwork laid by Next Step software, combined with lessons learned at Apple and Pixar, was now paying off. Steve Jobs was about to change the world again. Part 5, The iPhone Revolution, Reinventing the Phone and the World. As the 2000s progressed, Steve Jobs was no stranger to disruption. But even by his standards, what came next would be revolutionary not just for Apple, but for the entire world. The vision for the iPhone. Steve believed that the future wasn't just about computers or music players. The next big leap was in mobile communication. Phones had become ubiquitous but were frustrating: small keyboards, clunky interfaces, limited internet access. Steve imagined a device that combined a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator all in one sleek touchscreen package. The idea was audacious: to reinvent the phone from the ground up. The secret project. Apple kept the project tightly under wraps, codenamed Project Purple. Hundreds of engineers, designers, and software developers worked in secrecy for years. Jobs insisted on perfection, no compromises. He pushed his teams to create an entirely new user interface optimized for fingers, not still uses, or buttons. The software had to be powerful yet simple. Every detail from the glass screen to the tactile feedback was scrutinized. Overcoming challenges. Developing the iPhone wasn't easy. Apple had no experience building phones, so they partnered with hardware experts. Integrating cellular technology, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and the software ecosystem was a massive challenge. Jobs himself was involved in tough decisions from screen size to battery life. He famously said no to a physical keyboard, betting on the touch screen. This was risky, many doubted it would work. The big reveal, January 2007. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs took the stage at the Macworld conference and delivered one of the most memorable product launches ever. With his trademark black turtleneck and jeans, he introduced 3 devices in one: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator. Then he dropped the bombshell: today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. The crowd erupted. The iPhone was not just a product, it was a paradigm shift. Immediate impact. When the iPhone launched later that year, it was unlike anything the market had seen. Its multi-touch interface, smooth scrolling, and elegant design wowed users and critics alike. The App Store came a year later, opening the platform for developers to create millions of apps, fueling a new economy. Changing the rules. The iPhone redefined what a phone could be. It wasn't just a communication device, it was a powerful computer in your pocket. It changed how we interact with technology, access information, and connect with the world. Competitors scrambled to catch up, but Apple set the pace. Steve Jobs' leadership style at its peak. By this time, Steve's leadership was a mix of intensity and vision tempered by experience. He still demanded excellence and had a sharp tongue when things didn't meet his standards. But he had learned to listen more deeply, to trust his team, and to build a culture of innovation. He knew that Apple's success depended not just on him but on a strong team pushing boundaries together. The personal side, Steve Jobs' complex humanity. Behind the public persona was a man still deeply private, sometimes difficult, but driven by a desire to create lasting impact. His perfectionism sometimes caused friction, but his charisma inspired fierce loyalty. He faced health struggles in silence while continuing to lead Apple to new heights. A legacy in the making. The iPhone was the start of a new chapter for Apple and Steve Jobs. It laid the foundation for future innovations: the iPad, the Apple Watch, and the ecosystem that billions use today. More than products, Steve Jobs was reshaping culture, business, and technology itself. Part 6, The Final Acts, the iPad, Health Battles, and legacy. The rise of the iPad, expanding the digital ecosystem. After the monumental success of the iPhone, Steve Jobs wasn't done innovating. He saw a new opportunity to change how people consumed media and interacted with technology. The result? The iPad, introduced in 2010. At first, skeptics called it just a big iPhone or a device without a clear purpose. But Steve knew the iPad would create an entirely new category, a device perfect for reading, browsing, gaming, and creativity. The iPad combined the portability of a phone with the screen size and power of a laptop, all wrapped in Apple's signature design and ease of use. It quickly became a hit, redefining computing once again and further cementing Apple's ecosystem of devices working seamlessly together. Facing health challenges. Behind the scenes, Steve Jobs was battling serious health issues. He was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer in 2003. For years, he kept his illness private, continuing to lead Apple with his characteristic intensity and vision. His health struggles were a stark contrast to his public image of unstoppable energy and control. He underwent treatments, took medical leaves, and even had a liver transplant in 2009. Despite these challenges, Steve remained deeply involved in Apple's product development and strategy. Leadership transition and final years. As his health declined, Steve began preparing Apple for life beyond him. He brought in strong leaders like Tim Cook, who had already been handling many operational roles. Steve officially resigned as CEO in August 2011, naming Tim Cook as his successor but remaining chairman of the board. Just 2 months later, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away. His death marked the end of an era but also the beginning of his enduring legacy. The legacy of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs wasn't perfect. He was complex, brilliant but sometimes harsh, visionary but demanding. But his impact is undeniable. He changed multiple industries: personal computing, music, movies, phones, tablets, and digital publishing. He showed the world how design, technology, and storytelling could merge into products that didn't just work but inspired. His relentless pursuit of excellence pushed those around him to new heights. Apple today stands as one of the most valuable and influential companies in the world because of the foundation he built. Lessons from becoming Steve Jobs. This book reveals that Steve's greatness wasn't just in flashes of genius, but in his growth. He evolved from an impulsive young founder into a thoughtful, strategic leader. He learned to listen, to trust, and to empower others. He understood that innovation isn't just about ideas, it's about building teams and cultures that bring ideas to life. And perhaps most importantly, Steve Jobs' story teaches us about resilience, how setbacks and failures can lead to transformation. From being ousted at 30 to returning and leading Apple to unprecedented heights, his journey is one of relentless learning and becoming. Summing up the journey. Steve Jobs' life was anything but ordinary. From a rebellious kid with a passion for electronics, to a young visionary who changed personal computing, to a fall from grace, and then a remarkable comeback that reshaped the world, his story is powerful and inspiring. Becoming Steve Jobs isn't just about the products or the legendary presentations. It's about the man behind the myth, flawed, driven, and constantly evolving. Key lessons from Steve Jobs' life. Growth is a journey. Steve didn't become a great leader overnight. His early years were marked by impulsiveness and conflict. But he learned from failure, adapted, and grew. Success is often about who you become in the process, not just what you achieve. Vision needs execution. Having a bold vision isn't enough. Steve's later success came from combining his ideas with practical leadership, building strong teams, listening to others, and focusing relentlessly on quality. Design matters. Steve taught the world that technology should be beautiful and intuitive, not just functional. His obsession with design shaped Apple's culture and products, making them not only useful but deeply loved. Resilience in the face of setbacks. Getting fired from Apple could have ended Steve's career. Instead, it became a catalyst for growth. His journey shows how setbacks can lead to reinvention and new opportunities. Empowering others. Steve's evolution included learning to trust and empower creative people. Whether at Pixar or Apple, collaboration was key to turning vision into reality. Focus and simplicity. One of Steve's greatest leadership moves was simplifying Apple's product lines and focusing on what mattered most. This clarity helped Apple regain its edge and innovate. Leave a lasting impact. Steve wasn't just building products, he was shaping culture and changing how millions interact with technology. his legacy is about creating work that lasts beyond a lifetime. Final thoughts for you. Steve Jobs' life encourages us to think differently, not just about technology, but about ourselves. We all face challenges, doubts, and moments of failure. What matters is how we respond. Becoming someone greater isn't about sudden transformation. It's about persistent growth, learning from mistakes, and staying true to your vision while adapting to the world around you. Whether you're an entrepreneur, creator, or simply someone chasing a dream, Steve's story offers lessons in passion, resilience, and leadership. Thank you for joining me on this journey through becoming Steve Jobs. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified about more book summaries and insights here at Books Arena. What's a book or story you want me to summarize next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep becoming the best version of yourself.